Alright, let's talk about the Evil West Platinum. This is a genre that I'm very unaccustomed to. I basically never play shooters, I'm just too old and slow at this point in my life. But that being said, this game looked pretty fun, and the Platinum experience looked to be pretty good. It's not too long, there are 0 missable trophies, and the difficulty level is hard, but nothing too crazy. That being said, I was in for a bit of a surprise when I got to the end of the game and found it to be pretty difficult. Check out how chaotic this endgame fight is and how quickly I get mowed down. But we'll get to that soon. Let's back up and start with step 1 of the Platinum, beating the main game. There are a lot of story-related trophies that I'll skip here, but we can play the game on any difficulty level, so for this first playthrough, we'll start on normal difficulty to go for the Adept trophy. It's also important that we grab all collectibles on this first playthrough, so we'll be going for trophies like Chestnuts and Field Agent, both related to these collectibles. So let's talk about the highs and lows of this first playthrough. As I put my first few hours in the game, I really enjoyed the combat. And since combat really is the main focus of the game, that's a huge win. Maybe it's because I'm pretty unfamiliar with the genre, but the combat felt fast and chaotic in a good way. When a huge new enemy got spawned into the battle, it definitely got my blood pumping, and it was pretty exhilarating. There's a good amount of enemy variety, and depending on the combinations of the enemies that you're fighting, the fights can feel pretty different. For example, these flying beehive enemies are top priority. They put out a shield that protects all of the other enemies on the field, and so you have to take them out first. Similarly, these giant bats have an attack that can regenerate health, and so you have to really keep an eye on them during battle to make sure that they're not sitting there and just healing all of the enemies. Some other highlights were these gunslingers that teleport across the map. They're kind of snipers. And I also really like these werewolf-spider hybrids that shoot webs out and slow you down. The combat does get a little bit repetitive. Again, it's basically the only thing to do in the game, but it's a pretty short game overall, and I felt like it never really overstayed its welcome. So overall, thumbs up on the combat. I think it's really fun. In addition to really solid enemies, the weapons felt really unique. This is where we started to unlock our first couple of trophies. Here I get my first trophy of the game by performing my 15th finishing move. I get another one by killing 10 enemies in a row with my fists. I actually found the melee attacks pretty solid. I think I was probably about 50-50 between range attacks and melee attacks over the course of the game. And as I played through more of the game, I unlocked more weapons and perks for those weapons. I think my favorite weapon in the game was this stick of dynamite. When you fully upgrade it, it does a ton of damage and also summons this tornado that can do some AoE damage. I think this actually kind of highlights one of the weaknesses of the combat. The enemies just have a ton of health, and there's no great AoE options. So sometimes you're just stuck dealing with this mob of small creatures, and you really want to melt them. You're like super overpowered at this point, but it takes some time to get through them. I think that's the only downside to the combat that I can think of. To that end, the most disappointing weapon was probably the Gatling gun, which eventually turns into this death ray. This is the last weapon that you unlock in the game, and I really expected it to just mow through these lower level enemies, but as you can see, it takes some time to whittle away their health. It was a little bit disappointing. So speaking of weapon upgrades, let's also talk about collectibles, because they're very interrelated. The major collectible in this game is money. As you move through the levels, you'll find these piles of cash or chests sitting in between combat arenas. Not only is there a trophy for getting every one of these collectibles, but the money that you get from the collectibles is used to buy upgrades for your weapons. And there's a trophy for upgrading all of your weapons. And unfortunately, there's a lot of collectibles. Most levels have between 20 and 25 collectibles on the level, which is quite a lot. The game is super linear, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but having to keep an eye out for collectibles between every single battle just got a little bit old. I was super relieved to get these out of the way. Here I am collecting the Chestnut trophy, which you get for finding all of the collectibles in the game. But enough negativity, let's talk about another positive aspect to the game, again related to the combat, and this is the boss battles. There are 4 bosses in the game, and you get a trophy for beating each of them. You also get a trophy for beating each of them on even difficulty, but we'll save that for our second playthrough. On this first run, I really enjoyed seeing the boss's new patterns and movesets. My favorite boss was probably the third one. I really like this moment that reminded me of Phantom Ganon from Ocarina of Time. You have to shoot the fake versions of the boss out of the sky until you find the real one. I eventually took down each of these bosses to get their trophy, and after beating the final boss in the game, I get a couple of trophies related to beating my first playthrough. So on to playthrough number 2. There are 2 goals of this playthrough. The first is to beat the game on evil level difficulty. Now, you could have done this from the very start, but you need a second playthrough anyways because of the second reason. There's not enough money in one playthrough of the game to get every weapon unlocked that you need, and so you need to collect more money. I decided to just pick up the obvious collectibles along my way, and hopefully I would have enough by the end of this second playthrough, and luckily I just got there. But this was definitely stressful for the entirety of this second playthrough. I really didn't know if I missed too many, and I would have to start a third playthrough to collect even more cash. But luckily, I got enough on the very last level of the game, and was able to buy my final perk. In terms of difficulty level, I really liked Evil difficulty. The first part of the game isn't too bad because you face relatively easy mobs, and you have all of your weapons upgraded, but by the time that you get to the end of the game, it's a legitimate challenge. This room in particular was pretty tough. You have to make your way through 4 of these shield enemies with all of these range enemies throwing bombs at you, and you're only a couple of hits away from dying at any time. And then once you make it through these 4 tanks, 3 of these giant bats spawn at the same time. This is the only time in the game when you have to fight 3 simultaneously. They all have a ton of health, and they all can heal, so it really was this slow game of attrition, where you're slowly trying to chip away at their health, prevent them from healing, and also dodge all of their attacks, which are coming from 3 different directions. It was pretty tough. Similarly, the final boss is really fun on the hardest difficulty level, especially her final phase. You really have to learn all of her attack patterns and attack her when she's vulnerable. It's not quite as difficult or punishing as a boss from a Souls game, but it feels a little bit similar. You definitely have to know all of the patterns, you have to be quick on your feet, you have to avoid damage, all the classic boss moves. After beating the final boss, we get a few more trophies for beating the game on the hardest difficulty level. And with that, we're almost done. There's one more step left. Boss challenge trophies. Each boss has a trophy that requires you to beat them in a certain way. For this boss, you have to beat her without killing the minions that spawn. This one's pretty easy. All you have to do is let these minions run at you, and they'll explode, and just make sure that you never hit them. As another example, for the final boss, you have to beat her without using your health potion, which again, isn't that tough if you put it on the easiest difficulty level. These trophies were a bit grindy because you needed to replay a level to get all the way to the end to fight the boss, but ultimately, not too bad. After beating these boss challenges, I only had one more miscellaneous combat trophy left. I needed to slam 100 enemies. I guess slam was an attack that I basically never used throughout my playthroughs. So I started a chapter and slammed away until this final trophy popped. And with that, I got this platinum for a pretty fun shooter. I'm glad to have it on my list. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more platinum videos.